In the dusty heart of Montana's vast plains, where the sky stretched endlessly like a promise unkept, old rancher Harlan Thorne stood frozen in the doorway of his weathered barn. The words hung in the air like a sudden thunderclap, "It's too small, will it fit?" The young woman before him, Emily, a stranger who'd arrived unannounced that crisp autumn morning, tilted her head, her eyes wide with a mix of doubt and desperation. Harlan's calloused hands clenched the frayed edge of his flannel shirt, his mind racing back through decades of hardship, the droughts that had withered his crops, the winters that had claimed his livestock, and the loneliness that had etched deep lines into his sun-beaten face. He was a man of the land, tough as the rocky soil he tilled, but in that instant, he felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she'd pierced the armor he'd built around his solitary life. What was too small? His ranch? His dreams? Himself? Little did he know, this moment would unravel the threads of his isolation and weave them into a tapestry of unexpected humanity. Harlan had woken before dawn, as he always did, to the lowing of his few remaining cattle and the whisper of wind through the aspens. At 68, he was the last of his line, his wife gone 10 years to cancer, his children scattered to cities that promised more than the ranch could ever give. The Thorne Ranch, once sprawling across hundreds of acres, had shrunk over the years, sold off piece by piece to pay debts. What remained was a modest spread, a creaky farmhouse, a barn that leaned like an old friend, and a handful of animals that he tended with the devotion of a father. That morning, as he sipped his black coffee on the porch, a battered truck pulled up the gravel drive, kicking up dust that danced in the golden light. Out stepped Emily, her face framed by a ponytail of auburn hair, carrying a bundle wrapped in a faded quilt. She was no more than 30, with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much too soon. "Mr. Thorne," she'd called, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "I'm Emily Ruiz. I heard about you from the folks at the community center. They said you're the kind of man who helps when no one else will." Intrigued and cautious, Harlan had invited her in, offering her a seat at his scarred oak table. Over steaming mugs, she unfolded her story, a tale as old as the hills but fresh in its pain. Emily was a single mother from the nearby town of Billings, working 2 jobs to keep her family afloat after her husband had left them high and dry. But fate had dealt a crueler blow. A fire had ravaged their rented trailer just weeks ago, leaving her, her 2 young sons, and her elderly mother with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They'd been bouncing between shelters and friends' couches, but winter was closing in, and the cold Montana nights showed no mercy. "I don't want charity," Emily had insisted, her chin lifted proudly. "But I need a place to regroup, just for a bit. The center mentioned you have an old cabin on your property. Said you sometimes let folks use it in tough times." Harlan nodded slowly, remembering the tiny structure out back, a relic from his grandparents' era, barely more than a one-room shack with a potbelly stove and a loft. He'd fixed it up over the years, using it for storage mostly, but yes, he'd lent it to neighbors in need before. It was his quiet way of giving back, a nod to the ranchers who'd helped his family through lean years. "It's small," he'd warned her as they walked out to see it, the crunch of leaves underfoot echoing his doubts. And that's when she said it, peering inside the dim space, "It's too small, will it fit?" The word struck Harlan like a branding iron, hot and unyielding. He froze, his boots rooted to the earth as if the ground itself held him captive. Too small. The phrase echoed through his mind, dredging up memories he'd long buried. As a boy, he'd heard it from his father during the Great Depression reruns in family lore, too small a harvest, too small a herd, too small a man to save the farm. Later, when his wife lay dying, the doctors had shaken their heads, too small a chance, too small a miracle. And now, in his twilight years, the ranch itself felt too small, a shrinking island in a sea of progress where megafarms swallowed the little guys whole. Did Emily see him that way? A relic, inadequate, unable to provide even this simple shelter? His heart pounded, a mix of shame and defiance rising in his chest. But as he stood there, statue still, Emily turned to him, her expression softening. "The cabin's perfect, Mr. Thorne, Harlan. But this loft, it's too small for all of us. My boys are growing like weeds, and Mama needs space for her oxygen tank. Will it fit? I mean, could we maybe add a partition or something? I don't want to impose. The realization washed over Harlan like a cool rain after a drought. It wasn't about him at all. It was about her family, their needs, their survival. He exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders as he met her gaze. We'll make it fit, he said gruffly, his voice thicker than he'd intended. Come on, let's see what we can do. What followed was an unexpected turn, a pivot from his frozen shock to a flurry of action. Harlan rolled up his sleeves, and together they assessed the cabin. Emily, it turned out, was handy. Years of fixing things on her own had made her resourceful. They scavenged wood from the barn, hammered in dividers, and even rigged up extra bedding from old quilts Harlan's wife had sewn. As they worked, stories spilled out like water from a cracked dam. Emily spoke of her sons, Miguel and Tomas, 8 and 10, full of energy and dreams of becoming cowboys. Harlan shared tales of his youth, riding herd under starlit skies, the simple joys that money couldn't buy. By midday, the cabin transformed, not just physically, but into a symbol of shared effort. But as the sun climbed higher, another twist emerged. Emily's phone buzzed with news from the shelter. Her mother had taken a turn for the worse, the stress exacerbating her COPD. They needed to move in that very day, but the cabin still lacked basics: food, linens, a working heater. Harlan felt a profound shift inside him, a realization that cracked open the shell of his self-imposed solitude. For years, he'd hoarded his resources, convinced that giving too much would leave him with nothing. But seeing Emily's quiet strength, her unyielding love for her family, mirrored the selflessness he'd once known in his wife. "Stay here," he told her. "I'll handle the rest." He drove into town, his old Ford kicking up dust, and stopped at the general store. With his meager savings, he bought groceries, blankets, and a space heater. But as he loaded the truck, he overheard whispers from locals. News of the Ruiz family's plight had spread. Old Mrs. Jenkins from the diner approached him. "Harlan Thorne, you helping that young gal? Good on you. Take these pies, fresh baked." Then came Tom the mechanic, offering to fix up the cabin's wiring for free. Word traveled like wildfire through the tight-knit community, and by the time Harlan returned, a small convoy followed, neighbors with furniture, clothes, even toys for the boys. It was as if Emily's vulnerability had ignited a spark of collective kindness, reminding everyone of their own hidden struggles. The emotional climax built that evening as the sun dipped low, painting the plains in hues of orange and gold. Emily's family arrived, Miguel and Tomas bounding out of the truck with wide-eyed wonder, their grandmother wheezing but smiling faintly. Harlan watched from the porch as they settled in, the cabin now brimming with life. But the true peak came when Miguel, the younger boy, tugged at Harlan's sleeve. "Mister, is this your ranch? It's huge." Harlan chuckled, but then Emily pulled him aside. "I didn't expect this," she whispered, tears glistening. "You didn't just give us a place, you gave us hope." In that moment, Harlan froze again, but this time with overwhelming warmth. He realized his small life wasn't inadequate, it was a foundation for something greater. Impulsively, he offered more. "The boys can help with chores. Learn the ropes. And your mama, I'll drive her to appointments if need be." It was an act of generosity born from his own healed wounds, transforming not just their circumstances but his soul. The ranch, once a lonely outpost, now pulsed with purpose. As weeks turned to months, the bond deepened. The boys thrived under Harlan's tutelage, their laughter echoing across the fields as they fed the horses and mended fences. Emily found work at a local clinic, her resilience inspiring Harlan to expand his garden, sharing the bounty with neighbors. The cabin, once deemed too small, became a hub of community gatherings. Potlucks were stories of hardship and triumph intertwined. Harlan's profound realization lingered: true size isn't measured in acres or possessions, but in the expanse of one's heart. Through selflessness, he discovered the power of humanity, how one act of kindness ripples outward, mending broken spirits and forging unbreakable connections. In the end, on a starry night much like the ones of his youth, Harlan sat on the porch with Emily's family, the boys asleep in the loft. "You know," he said softly, "I thought I was the one helping you. But you saved me from my own small world." Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's the beauty of it, we all fit together when we try." And in that heartwarming truth lay the uplifting message: no matter how small we feel, our capacity for compassion is boundless, capable of fitting the whole world inside. It leaves us inspired, hopeful that in America's vast landscapes and beyond, kindness will always find a way to make room. The sun hung low over the Montana horizon, casting long shadows across the parched earth of Thorn Ranch. Harlan Thorn, a weathered rancher in his late 60s, paused mid-stride as he carried a bale of hay toward the barn. His boots crunched against the gravel, but his body went rigid, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on his broad shoulders. From the open door of his small guest cabin, a young woman's voice cut through the crisp air like a knife. "It's too small, will it fit?" Harlan froze instantly, his mind reeling. Too small. The words echoed in his ears, stirring up a storm of memories he'd long tried to bury: the failed crops, the lost livestock, the empty rooms in his farmhouse where laughter used to echo. He was a man who'd spent his life wrestling with the land, but in that moment, he felt dwarfed by it all. What was she referring to? His humble offering? His life? Little did he know, this stranger's words would unravel the threads of his isolation and weave them into a story of profound humanity, kindness, and the unexpected power of selflessness. Harlan's day had started like any other in the vast, unforgiving expanse of rural Montana. He rose before dawn, the creak of his old bed frame the only sound in the silent house. At 68, he moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd carried too many burdens. His hands, rough and scarred from decades of roping cattle and mending fences, gripped the coffee pot as he brewed his morning ritual: black, strong, no sugar. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, but time and circumstance had whittled it down. Once, it spanned thousands of acres, a thriving operation with herds of Angus cattle grazing under endless blue skies. Now, it was just Harlan, a dozen head of cattle, a few chickens scratching in the dirt, and a barn that sagged under the weight of years. His wife, Clara, had passed a decade ago from a relentless cancer that no amount of prayer or hard work could defeat. Their 2 children, grown and gone to the cities, Seattle for his daughter, Denver for his son, called occasionally, but the distance felt like a chasm. Harlan didn't blame them, the ranch life was hard, unforgiving. But in his quieter moments, he wondered if he'd failed them, if his world had always been too small to hold their dreams. As he sipped his coffee on the porch, watching the first light kiss the distant Rockies, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon. A beat-up Chevy truck rattled up the long driveway, its tires kicking up pebbles like scattered thoughts. Harlan set down his mug and stood, his Stetson pulled low over his graying hair. Out stepped a woman, no older than 30, with auburn hair tied back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held a depth of weariness beyond her years. She wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt, practical clothes for someone used to getting by. In her arms, she carried a bundle wrapped in a worn quilt, and behind her, the truck's door opened to reveal 2 young boys peeking out shyly, and an older woman in the passenger seat, her face lined with age and hardship. "Mr. Thorne," the woman called, her voice steady but laced with a hint of desperation. "I'm Emily Ruiz. I hope I'm not intruding. The folks at the Billings Community Center sent me. They said you're the kind of man who doesn't turn away those in need." Harlan nodded, his curiosity piqued. He wasn't one for visitors, but the center had a reputation for helping folks down on their luck, and he'd lent a hand there before, donating surplus hay or fixing up equipment for their events. "Come on in," he said gruffly, gesturing to the porch steps. "Coffee's hot." Emily thanked him, signaling for her family to wait in the truck. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, with its linoleum floors and walls adorned with faded photos of better days, she sat at the scarred oak table and unfolded her story. It poured out like a river breaching its banks. Emily was a single mother, raising her sons Miguel and Tomas, aged 8 and 10, after her husband had abandoned them 2 years prior. She'd worked as a waitress and a housekeeper, scraping by in a cramped trailer on the outskirts of Billings. But 3 weeks ago, disaster struck. An electrical fire had consumed everything they owned in a blaze of smoke and flames. They escaped with their lives, but little else. Shelters were overflowing, friends' couches were temporary, and with winter's chill creeping in, they needed stability. "I'm not looking for handouts," Emily said, her chin lifted defiantly. "But the center mentioned you have an old cabin on your property. Said you've let families use it before, just to get back on their feet. I can pay a little rent once I find steady work, and I'll help around the ranch if you need it." Harlan listened, his face impassive but his heart stirring. He remembered the cabin, a one-room structure his grandfather had built in the 1920s, with a loft for sleeping and a small kitchenette. It had a potbelly stove for heat and a tin roof that sang in the rain. He'd kept it up over the years, using it for storage or the occasional drifter passing through. A few times, he'd opened it to neighbors hit by floods or layoffs, a quiet act of kindness in memory of Clara, who always said the land was meant to be shared. "It's not much," Harlan warned as they walked out back, the boys now trailing behind, their eyes wide at the sight of the cattle in the pasture. Tomas, the older one, pointed excitedly at a calf. "Mama, look! Real cowboys live here." Emily smiled faintly, but as they stepped inside the cabin, dust motes dancing in the sunlight filtering through grimy windows, her expression shifted. She scanned the space, the single bed, the cramped loft accessed by a rickety ladder, the tiny table squeezed against the wall. "It's too small, will it fit?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Those words hit Harlan like a gust of wind off the plains, knocking the breath from his lungs. He froze in the doorway, his frame silhouetted against the light, unable to move or speak. Too small. It was as if she'd voiced the secret fear that had haunted him for years. His ranch was too small now, diminished by bank loans and bad seasons. His life felt too small, confined to routines that no longer held meaning. When Clara died, the world had shrunk around him, leaving him adrift in a sea of what-ifs. Had he been too small a man to save her? To keep his family close? The boys' chatter faded into the background as his mind spiraled. Emily turned, noticing his stillness, her brow furrowing. "Harlan. You okay?" He blinked, forcing himself back to the present. "Yeah, just thinking." But as she explained, the loft's tight for the boys and Mama's oxygen tank. Will it all fit without crowding? A wave of relief crashed over him. It wasn't a judgment on him, it was practical worry for her family. The realization was profound, a sudden clarity that pierced the fog of his self-doubt. This wasn't about his inadequacies, it was about their needs, and in that shift, Harlan saw an opportunity to expand beyond himself. "We'll make it work," he said, his voice gaining strength. What followed was an unexpected turn, a whirlwind of activity that transformed the afternoon. Harlan rolled up his sleeves, his muscles still strong from years of labor, and together they assessed the cabin. Emily proved to be a force, resourceful and determined. She'd learned to fix things on her own after her husband's departure. They scavenged lumber from the barn's scrap pile, hammering in a simple partition to create a separate nook for her mother. Miguel and Tomas, initially shy, joined in, their small hands holding nails and fetching tools, their laughter filling the air like music Harlan hadn't heard in years. As they worked, conversations flowed. Emily shared snippets of her life, the joy of watching her boys play soccer, the pain of late-night bills, the dream of one day owning a small home. Harlan opened up too, recounting tales of his youth, breaking wild horses under his father's watchful eye, the thrill of a successful calving season, the quiet evenings with Clara stargazing on the porch. "Life out here teaches you humility," he said, nailing a board into place. But it also shows you what's real, people helping people. By midday, sweat beading on their foreheads, the cabin began to take shape. But then came another twist. Emily's phone rang, a call from the shelter. Her mother, Rosa, had suffered a breathing episode from the stress, and the doctor recommended immediate rest in a stable environment. They needed to move in today, but the cabin lacked essentials, fresh linens, food stocks, even a reliable heater for the coming cold snaps. Harlan felt a pang, his own pantry bare from a lean harvest. Yet, in that moment, a deeper realization dawned: he'd spent too long hoarding his scant resources, fearing depletion. Seeing Emily's unwavering love for her family mirrored the selflessness Clara had embodied, always giving to others even when they had little. "You stay here and finish up," Harlan told her. "I'll run into town."